I think I said at the start of looking at these poems of Keats that as his poetry goes on, we get a sense of sort of resignation from him. He seems to sort of understand where he fits in the grand scheme of things. He seems to sort of get over this tendency to be a little bit melancholic, and he seems to actually accept the fact that life maybe should be transitory. And that actually the alternative isn't any good to anyone. We see hints of that in Ode to a Nightingale and Ode on a Grecian Urn. But the next two poems, I think, really show Keats coming to grips with the transience of life, and perhaps by extension, the fact that his poetry won't be remembered. You know, he fears in the way that the great classical poetry will be that he references so often. And Ode on Melancholy is basically Keats just almost having a word with himself and saying, just kind of stop this, really. I've said, before that the first two poems are full of this sense of melancholy in the sounds, in the assonance, but also in the imagery and in some of the themes that they express. Ode to a Nightingale in particular, where he wants to sort of he's torn between life and death. This is Keats basically almost acknowledging that, again, in that very self-aware way that the later romantics do, and basically saying, get a grip, you've got to stop focusing so much on melancholy. So this is his poem where he directly addresses this, which then paves the way for Sonnet on the Sea, and perhaps, as I said before, that slightly more positive way of viewing the fact that on his gravestone it says, "Here lies one whose name is writ in water." So it starts with no, go not to Leith. So straight away he's speaking to himself here. In the last two poems he's been speaking to the urn and to the nightingale respectively. In this one it seems like actually he's talking to himself. He's mentioned Leith before, the river of forgetfulness. So he's almost referencing earlier poetry and going, look, you need to sort of stop doing this. Neither twist wolfsbane tight rooted for its poisonous wine. So again, this sense of, he's referenced the wine in Ode to a Nightingale. He referenced hemlock, which is sort of similar to wolfsbane, these kind of herbal drugs that were meant to bring on tiredness or forgetfulness. Nor suffer thy pale forehead to be kissed by nightshade, ruby grape of prosopine. So again, notice the shade and the grape, that assonance there, the pale, so that A sound sort of going throughout. Basically talking about the fact that, there's that contrast between his own pale forehead and the ruby red grapes, the wine that he's talking about. Again, a lot of these ideas were referenced in Ode to a Nightingale. It's almost like he's deconstructing that earlier poem and kind of picking apart the imagery and kind of going, look, I need to get over this. Make not your rosary of yew berries, nor let the beetle nor the death moth be your mournful psyche. So again, notice the rosary, the beetle, the mournful, those long vowel sounds, the nor, mournful psyche, nor the downy owl. I mean, that's a great example of the assonance that we get in Keats, which, gives this sense of the poem almost sort of dripping with that wine, with that laziness, with that laconic style, and yet he's saying to himself, to kind of stop doing this, snap out of it. So the poem is a bit of a weird one, because on the one hand he's kind of taking those images from before and saying, look, I need to get over this. On the other hand, there is an element of kind of almost reveling and enjoying in that. A partner in your sorrow's mysteries, for shade to shade will come too drowsily and drown the wakeful anguish of the soul. Okay, so again, the shade, wakeful, the drowsy, which we've had before, and drown. Notice those repeated sounds that we get over and over again, and he's sort of saying, basically that the wakeful anguish of your soul is actually normal and natural, and that's the human thing. The pain and the regret and the transience of life is the thing that makes you human and makes you alive. And actually, do you really want to be drowsy and actually drowned out and just kind of numb? Surely it's better to be in some kind of pain than to be numb. And that's the debate he seems to be sort of having with himself. Notice that iambic pentameter. So for shade to shade will come too drowsily and drown the wakeful anguish of the soul. So we get that meter kind of going throughout this poem. The iambic pentameter obviously was liked by the Romantics because it was in line with what Milton used in Paradise Lost, what Shakespeare often uses in his sonnets and his drama as well, and Keats takes this on as well. So on the one hand, this poem is kind of looking back to that earlier poetry. On the other hand, it's looking back further to the kind of classical mythology. On the other hand, Keats is kind of saying, look, live with present pain. That is better than kind of being lost in these things that are gone, that are dead, that are numb. But when the melancholy fit shall fall sudden from heaven like a weeping cloud that fosters the droop-headed flowers all, and hides the green hill in an April shroud. There's ways of reading this that say basically he's talking about depression here. You know, the melancholy fit, sorry, shall fall. So we've got this idea of Keats being, the melancholy kind of falls upon him. The melancholy isn't his own feeling; it's a feeling that kind of drops on him that he can't entirely control. A lot of people would argue that that's typical of talking about depression or other mental illness. That again, that alliteration "fit shall fall" emphasises the fact that it sort of comes upon him, it drops upon him, it's uncontrollable, it's sudden from heaven like a weeping cloud. It's like being rained on. So again, he's linking, I guess, pantheism here. Look at the natural imagery here, the sense of weeping, the sense of heaven, but looking at it in a very different way, that actually he's not entirely in control of all of his own feelings. Wordsworth in the first generation talks about the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, and that's what this is, isn't it? Keats is talking about this spontaneous overflow that he can't entirely control. But of course, like Wordsworth, Keats is saying, no, you need more sober pleasure, you need to accept it, you need to acknowledge it, and live with that. So notice the droop-headed flowers, the green hill. So all these, common romantic images are actually being hidden by an April shroud. So a shroud was commonly put over the face of someone once they'd died, and that's what he's saying here. You're shrouding all this classical romantic imagery. So, if we kind of look at this self-aware nature of the poem, Keats is almost saying to himself that you're in danger of kind of losing everything about romantic poetry. You're in danger of losing what you want to be by just being overcome with this melancholy. Then glut thy sorrow on a morning rose, or on the rainbow of the salt sand wave, or on the wealth of globed peonies. Or if thy mistress some rich anger shows, imprison her soft hand and let her rave, and feed deep, deep upon her peerless eyes. So quite a long section here where Keats is kind of saying, glut your sorrow, experience this. You need to kind of experience this sadness. You can't be kind of numb to it. The salt sand wave, I think, is important when we look at Sonnet on the Sea, the next poem. Again, remember, Keats' gravestone says, here lies one whose name is written water, and water becomes a particularly important image, I think, in a couple of these later poems. Or on the wealth of glowed peonies, notice that assonance again. Or if thy mistress some rich anger shows, imprison her soft hand and let her rave, and feed deep, deep upon her peerless eyes. In other words, feel, if whether it's from a problem in your love life, feed on it, make the most of it. If it's pain, it means that you're alive. It's better than being numb, and that's the sense that Keats is kind of talking about here. Notice that feed deep, peerless, again, that assonance, almost like he's drinking it in himself. Obviously, there's a story of Fanny Brawle and the fact that Keats essentially wasn't rich enough and didn't have the means to support her, and kind of lost that love. And there's that sense here that, he's almost sort of saying better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. Wordsworth also talks about feeding deep on nature and being fed and being sustained by the natural world. And Keats is sort of talking about the same thing, I guess, from an emotional point of view, that actually even negative emotions are feelings and are better than the kind of numbness that he's contemplated in the two earlier poems. She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die. And here I think he's talking about melancholy itself. She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die. In Ode on a Grecian Urn, he talks about how the beauty will never fade on this urn, but obviously that's because it's not real life. Notice that caesura there, that you've got the word beauty either side of it. So melancholy is with beauty, pause, beauty that must die. I think that caesura really emphasises that idea that trying to hold beauty in stasis will fail. The urn does it, but because it's not real beauty, it's an impression of it. And that acknowledgement with Keats, I guess, that everything kind of must die, that pain is a part of life, that beauty will fade and will die, and that trying to see otherwise does take you on this path to melancholy. And joy whose hand is ever at his lips bidding adieu, an aching pleasure nigh. Notice the enjambment there. Joy whose hand is ever at his lips bidding adieu. This sense that actually from one line to the next, like with the caesura, Keats is emphasising how beauty and joy are transient things, that they don't last forever. Every time you experience joy, it's going to pass, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't experience the joy because you're waiting for it to end. An aching pleasure nigh, and again, aching pleasure. Wordsworth talks about sober pleasure, and I think it's the same thing. It's that understanding that the pleasure of youth will fade, but ultimately accepting that that's okay. turning to poison while the bee mouth sips. Yeah, so if you dwell too much on this pleasure that has gone, it turns to poison. And this sense that Keats, I guess, has done that with the urn and with the nightingale, that these things that sustain Wordsworth are in danger of actually killing Keats, is because he's not accepted the change that happens later in life. When you think about the end of Tinton Abbey, where Wordsworth is talking to Dorothy, if you imagine those words spoken to Keats, I think that helps you connect these romantics a little bit more. That Keats is kind of at the point where Wordsworth almost was. I, in the very temple of delight, veiled melancholy has a sovereign shrine. Okay, veiled is interesting. So veiled because it's hidden, because you don't kind of see it. Maybe veiled because it's just behind the pleasure and the joy. You know, it's possibly a way of seeing it. Equally, you could argue that the veil, you know, is linked to marriage. You know, Keats talks about failed love earlier. There is the Fanny Brawne story as well. So, you know, you could also argue perhaps that the veil is linking melancholy directly to Keats' own experiences in love. Though seen of none save him whose strenuous tongue can burst joy's grape against his palate fine, his soul shall taste the sadness of her might, and be among her cloudy trophies hung. So melancholy is something that kind of exists for everyone. But look at that bit, you know, at the end, basically. Melancholy is seen by the person who bursts the grape of joy against his palate fine, and again there's that sense of it being transient, isn't it? As soon as you burst the grape, which is the pleasurable thing to get the juice, it's gone. His soul shall taste the sadness of her might, and be among her cloudy trophies hung. Notice that turn at the end. You know, Keats is saying that basically once that grape is burst, that's when you'd experience the melancholy. But notice that last line, and be among her cloudy trophies hung. As with the melancholy being something that Keats can't quite control, we get the same sense here that Keats is saying, you know, if I dwell too much on this, if I am so kind of hung up that the joy of the grape or whatever is transient, then I will be hung among the cloudy trophies. He becomes like the urn. He becomes something still. He becomes simply a trophy. He stops being something living. So I think in this one he does finally reconcile the fact that he has to experience joy and just enjoy it as best he can. He has to experience pain, because to do so is to be alive, and to fail to do so is to be every bit as inanimate as the Grecian urn. And that's why I think Sonnet on the Sea, about something that is living and that moves, that is the exact opposite of the Grecian urn, is the logical kind of last poem that we look at by Keats.